the soft hum of flight attendants bustling around the cabin, the hiss of coffee machines, and the clinking of champagne flutes formed a familiar symphony that Jenna Williams had come to know by heart. In her 10 years with Transatlantic Airways, she'd learned to anticipate every sound, every gesture, and every interaction. Tonight, however, something felt different. A heaviness in the air that mirrored the tense mood sweeping the nation. Jenna moved with practiced precision as she prepped for the Los Angeles to New York flight. Born and raised in Harlem, she had always carried with her a keen awareness of the world's layered complexities. She knew what it was like to feel unseen, to be dismissed, and to quietly rise above it all. She'd watched as protests filled the streets, as debates about inequality rang out from family dinner tables to corporate boardrooms. Yet, for all the noise, true change felt painfully distant, an echo rather than a reality. As Jenna glanced out at the rows of seats, she couldn't help but notice the stark divide. First class, draped in opulence, overflowed with plush leather seats, silver-trimmed trays, and glasses of champagne that seemed to refill themselves. On the other side of the thin, yet rigid barrier lay economy, cramped, lined with weary travelers, and filled with the aroma of pretzels and reheated meals. It was a divide Jenna had become used to navigating. But tonight, the weight of it pressed on her chest a little heavier than usual. Moving through first class, Jenna greeted the passengers with her usual warmth, smiling politely as she exchanged brief nods with businessmen engrossed in their laptops, couples laughing quietly over shared secrets, and the occasional solo traveler lost in a thick paperback. She had just approached a middle-aged woman in an expensive designer dress when she felt it, the sudden chill of being dismissed before even a single word was exchanged. The woman didn't bother to make eye contact, her gaze fixed pointedly out the window as Jenna stood beside her. "Ma'am, would you like another drink?" Jenna asked, keeping her tone professional, even as she felt a small pang of discomfort. She was used to being treated like an invisible fixture by certain first-class passengers. But tonight, it grated on her in a way she couldn't quite shake. The woman didn't look up. "I didn't ask for you," she replied coolly. "Where's the other girl?" There was an unmistakable venom in her voice, the kind that seeped under the skin and lingered. Jenna felt the sting, sharp and familiar. Her mind flashed with memories, moments when her presence had been questioned, her competence doubted, her dignity subtly chipped away. One comment at a time, she took a steadying breath, swallowing the instinct to push back, to remind this woman that she was no one's girl. "If there's something you need, I'd be happy to assist you, ma'am," Jenna replied, her voice smooth as silk. Perfect mask. But the woman wasn't done. Without warning, she reached out, her hand clamping around Jenna's wrist with surprising force. Jenna's eyes widened as she felt the sharp press of manicured nails digging into her skin, a silent, simmering anger rising within her. "You people," the woman spat, her words barely more than a hiss, "should know your place." A shiver ran down Jenna's spine, but she didn't move, her face remaining calm even as her heart raced. Around her, the hum of conversation began to still as nearby passengers noticed the woman's icy words and her iron grip on Jenna's wrist. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin, the kind that signaled something was about to break. "Ma'am, please release me," Jenna said, her voice firmer now, her composure unshaken but her patience wearing thin. And then, in an instant, everything exploded. Jenna's calm shattered in the blink of an eye. Before she could fully process what was happening, the woman tightened her grip and leaned forward, her face twisted with a sneer. The words that tumbled out next were cold, seething, and packed with years of entitlement that had never been challenged. Jenna felt her wrist ache under the woman's hold. But it wasn't just the pain that struck her. It was the look in the woman's eyes, a look that told Jenna she was less than, that her very presence was an offense. "Let go of me, ma'am," Jenna said firmly, trying to remain composed even as her own heart hammered with a familiar, suppressed anger. "I am here to assist you, but I won't tolerate this." The woman's response was a laugh, a short, disdainful laugh that was somehow colder than her words. "Assist me?" she scoffed, her voice carrying through the first-class cabin. "I don't need assistance from your kind." The cabin was no longer just a space filled with seats and passengers. It had become an audience, silent and watching, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, shock, and curiosity. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide as they strained to hear. Others were already recording, their phones raised discreetly but unmistakably, capturing every word, every motion, every expression. But just as Jenna began to pull her wrist back, attempting to remove herself from the situation, the woman's grip tightened even more, and then, without warning, she lunged forward, her teeth sinking into Jenna's arm with a ferocity that no one had expected. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Jenna staggered back, clutching her arm, the sting of the bite sending a jolt of pain up her entire body. She looked down to see blood beginning to seep through her sleeve, crimson against the crisp white of her uniform. The shock of it left her momentarily speechless, as if the world had slowed, each second stretching out into eternity. All around her, passengers erupted into chaos. Did she just bite her? Oh my God! Someone get security! Phones shot up in the air, capturing the chaos from every angle. Some passengers shouting for the woman's arrest, others frozen in stunned silence, not quite able to comprehend the reality of what they had just witnessed. A man in a nearby seat stood up, crossing the aisle in a few long strides. He reached for the woman, pulling her back from Jenna with a firm, steady hand. "Enough," he said, his voice tense with controlled anger. "You've gone too far." But the woman twisted in his grip, fury blazing in her eyes as she screamed, "I'm not the problem. It's you people thinking you belong here, acting like you're one of us." Jenna, clutching her arm, tried to steady herself. Her head spun, both from the pain and the raw humiliation that burned through her chest. She took a breath, forcing herself to look the woman in the eye one last time, refusing to let this incident rob her of her dignity. "Ma'am," Jenna said, her voice steady but low, "there's no place for your hatred here." But the woman only sneered, her rage unrelenting as she continued to hurl insults, her words dripping with venom. Two more passengers, unable to bear it any longer, stood and restrained her, pinning her arms gently but firmly to her sides. By now, the flight crew had intervened, with the captain's voice crackling over the intercom, announcing an emergency diversion to Chicago. Jenna barely registered the announcement. Her focus was on staying calm, keeping her emotions in check despite the firestorm around her. She was no longer just Jenna Williams, a flight attendant. She had become a target, a victim of raw prejudice that had unfolded in front of an entire plane of witnesses. As she looked around, she noticed the passengers watching her, their faces a blend of sympathy, anger, and, for some, guilt. She could feel the weight of their stares, the silent acknowledgement that they had witnessed something ugly and visceral, something that went beyond a single hateful incident. It was a moment that would leave its mark, one that felt bigger than the small space of the cabin where it had erupted. Minutes later, the plane began its descent, the city lights of Chicago glinting outside the windows as law enforcement awaited their arrival on the ground. Jenna, still clutching her injured arm, steadied herself, preparing to disembark. She wasn't sure what awaited her beyond the plane. But one thing was clear: the world had just seen, in full, undeniable view, the ugliness of entitlement and racism. And as the flight touched down, Jenna knew that her story, her pain, was no longer just hers alone. As Flight 1275 began its descent, the hum of the engines was the only sound cutting through the tense silence. The cabin, once filled with quiet conversations and the comforting clinks of dinner service, had transformed into a charged atmosphere, thick with disbelief and anger. Jenna Williams sat in her jump seat near the galley, pressing a cloth to her wounded arm. The bite mark throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the raw ache in her chest. She could feel every gaze, every phone raised in silent solidarity or shame, and every quiet murmur that filled the space. Outside the window, Chicago's city lights stretched across the skyline like a beacon in the night. The passengers had all been informed of the emergency landing, and most sat upright, eyes fixed on the disheveled woman in handcuffs, now seated near the front of the plane under the watchful eye of two passengers who had restrained her. Her face was flushed with fury, her body tense, as if daring anyone to look her way. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the cabin erupted with the sounds of passengers grabbing their bags, shifting in their seats, and anxiously whispering about the ordeal they had just witnessed. A surge of relief mixed with anger pulsed through Jenna as she realized they were finally on the ground. Her arm throbbed with every beat of her heart, a vivid reminder of the ordeal she had just endured. The plane taxied to a secluded area of the terminal, where flashing blue and red lights greeted them through the windows. A team of officers waited at the bottom of the stairs, their expressions unreadable but their presence unmistakable. Jenna felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that she was finally safe. Dread that the nightmare was still unfolding. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until law enforcement can address the situation at hand. We thank you for your cooperation and patience." The passengers held their collective breath as the plane door opened, the cool Chicago night air rushing in. One officer stepped aboard, scanning the cabin until his eyes settled on the woman in handcuffs. She sneered at him, her defiance unbroken, her hatred like a smoldering fire. As the officers approached her, the woman's voice cut through the silence once more. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. It's them." She spat, her gaze landing on Jenna, dripping with contempt. These people, always causing trouble. The officers, unfazed, lifted her to her feet. She struggled, but they held her firmly, guiding her toward the door. "Ma'am, please calm down and cooperate," one of the officers said, his tone unyielding. Passengers watched as she was led down the aisle, some murmuring in outrage, others in silence, each processing the events in their own way. Jenna caught the eye of a young woman seated nearby, her face etched with sympathy and a quiet admiration. She mouthed a silent, "Thank you," and Jenna, despite everything, managed a small nod in return. As the woman disappeared down the stairs, her muffled curses fading with each step, Jenna felt a strange sense of closure. But the true weight of what had happened was only beginning to settle. An officer approached Jenna, his expression softening as he noted her bloodied sleeve. "Ma'am, are you all right? We have paramedics waiting to take a look at your arm." Jenna nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'll be okay," she replied, though she could feel the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving her exhausted and raw. She glanced back at the passengers, many of whom were still recording, some offering her encouraging nods, others frozen in their seats. The flight had become a public stage, and Jenna was at the center of it. As she was escorted off the plane, the cool night air hit her skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling tension of the cabin. Flashing lights and camera flashes greeted her as she descended the stairs, her heart racing at the sudden exposure. She'd never wanted to be the center of attention, never imagined that her simple act of trying to do her job would land her here, under the glare of flashing lights, with her pain broadcast for the world to see. A paramedic approached her, guiding her to a waiting ambulance as she took a deep breath, trying to process the whirlwind of the past few hours. She felt the sting of antiseptic as the paramedic cleaned her wound, her mind racing with questions and memories, each more painful than the last. As she sat in the ambulance, she could see the passengers beginning to disembark, some speaking to reporters who had gathered at the gate, others rushing away, eager to put the night behind them. But Jenna knew this was only the beginning for her. The videos were already circulating. The headlines were already forming. This incident wasn't going to fade into obscurity. It was about to become part of something much larger than herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it, her focus narrowing to a single, steady thought. What happened tonight was wrong, and it couldn't go unanswered. She'd stayed silent through years of microaggressions, biting her tongue and rising above the subtle slights and outright disrespect. But this was different. This was undeniable, visceral, and cruel. Jenna sat back, her eyes fixed on the flashing lights reflecting off the ambulance's interior, feeling the anger and pain shift into something sharper, something with purpose. She was no longer just a flight attendant wounded by a passenger's hate. She was a voice, and now, she was ready to be heard. By the time Jenna left the hospital with her arm bandaged and her heart still aching, the world had already seen everything. Every angle of the incident, every painful second of her humiliation, had spread like wildfire across social media, television, and news sites. Jenna Williams, a woman who had spent her career working quietly and tirelessly in the skies, was now the reluctant face of a viral story. Jenna's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd stepped off the plane. Messages from friends, family, and even strangers flooded in, some sending messages of support, others offering apologies as if they too felt implicated by what had happened to her. As she lay in her small hotel room that night, staring at the ceiling, Jenna felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The world was watching, and everyone had an opinion. When she woke the next morning, exhausted but restless, Jenna decided to go for a walk. Chicago's morning air was brisk, and the sidewalks bustled with life as if nothing had happened. As she passed by cafes and shop windows, Jenna caught snippets of conversation that stopped her in her tracks. People were talking about her. "Did you hear about the flight attendant? Bitten right on the job. Can you believe it? It's more than just the attack. It's what it means. This is what people of color face every day, in every job. And now everyone's finally seeing it." Jenna's steps slowed as she processed their words. She knew what had happened to her was horrifying, but now, hearing others put it into words, it struck her with renewed force. This wasn't just about one angry woman on one terrible night. This was a reflection of a much larger, deeply entrenched problem, and it was affecting people everywhere. For so many, her story was a painful reminder of the injustice they too had suffered, the indignities they had endured in silence. She continued her walk, feeling a strange pull to see the city around her. She passed a newsstand with a fresh stack of newspapers, her own image front and center, eyes wide with shock and pain as she clutched her arm. The headline read, "Flight 1275 Incident Sparks National Outrage. Is this America's tipping point?" Jenna felt a surge of emotion. She'd never wanted to be the center of a public spectacle. And yet, here she was. Later that morning, Jenna received a call from her airline. They offered her the rest of the month off with pay, counseling services, and assured her that the passenger had been banned from flying with their airline for life. They wanted to smooth things over, but she sensed something else beneath their offers: fear. The airline knew that Jenna's story had captured the nation's attention, and they were scrambling to contain the fallout. But Jenna wasn't thinking about smoothing things over. For years, she had watched as flight attendants, particularly women of color, faced insults, harassment, and even violence, all while maintaining a flawless smile and the unspoken understanding that their dignity was secondary to a passenger's comfort. She had stayed silent, believing that this was just part of the job. Now, though, she felt that silence shatter within her. Before she could fully process what she was doing, Jenna called her airline back, asking to speak to the executive team. Her voice was calm but resolute as she explained her decision. "I'll accept your time off, but I want to do more than just take a break. I want to help make changes." There was a pause on the other end, a brief moment of uncertainty, before the representative spoke. "Ms. Williams, we would be open to hearing your suggestions." Jenna hung up, feeling a new energy course through her. For once, the idea of change felt real, like something she could actually touch, shape, and make happen. She began to jot down ideas, fueled by her own experience and the countless stories she had heard from fellow attendants who had suffered in silence. Policies to protect flight attendants from abusive passengers. Training programs to help staff handle situations without compromising their dignity. Clear protocols for banning violent passengers, ensuring they faced lasting consequences. And as she wrote, Jenna felt the weight of her trauma begin to lift. For the first time since the incident, she felt more than just pain, she felt purpose. That evening, Jenna posted a statement on her social media account. Her words were simple, yet powerful. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of every person who has been treated as less than, whose dignity has been chipped away, piece by piece, because of prejudice and entitlement. I didn't ask to become the center of a national conversation. But now that I am here, I intend to make this moment count. We need change, real change, and I will not rest until we see it." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People from all over the country shared her message, commenting with their own stories of discrimination and abuse. Celebrities, activists, and public figures voiced their support, amplifying Jenna's call for change. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of anger, frustration, and a shared desire for justice. Jenna's inbox overflowed with messages from reporters, civil rights organizations, and even lawmakers wanting to hear from her, to understand how they could help. It was dizzying, and at times overwhelming, but Jenna knew this was bigger than her own fear or discomfort. She was standing at the edge of something powerful, a wave of change that could sweep across an entire industry and maybe, just maybe, reach even further. As the night wore on, Jenna looked out the window of her hotel room, the city lights stretching endlessly into the darkness. She took a deep breath, letting herself feel the depth of this moment, the gravity of the work that lay ahead. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a voice for everyone who had been ignored, silenced, or dismissed, and with the entire nation watching, Jenna vowed to make her voice heard. The morning after her statement went viral, Jenna sat in a small cafe near her hotel, staring at her phone as it continued to light up with notifications. Messages from all over the country, and even some from abroad, filled her screen. People pouring their stories, support, and outrage into her inbox. Jenna could barely keep up with the flood of emotions coming from every corner. Strangers shared their own experiences with discrimination, their own moments of feeling small, overlooked, and dismissed. But there were other messages, too, ones that carried weight and intention. A civil rights lawyer reached out, offering to help Jenna file a formal complaint. A media outlet wanted to fly her in for a sit-down interview, and several flight attendants from other airlines reached out, telling her that her bravery had inspired them, that they were ready to speak out too. As she sipped her coffee, Jenna felt the energy shift around her. She was no longer just a passenger in her own story. She was in the driver's seat, guiding it forward. And yet, despite the swell of support, a sliver of doubt clung to her. Was she ready to take this on? Could she really carry the weight of this movement on her shoulders? Just as she was deep in thought, her phone buzzed with a call from her airline spokesperson. Jenna took a steadying breath and answered, listening as the spokesperson informed her of a media briefing they had scheduled for later that day. "We'd like you to attend, Jenna." The voice on the other end said, "It's important to show the public that we're united in addressing this incident. We're here to support you." The words sounded hollow. United? Jenna's mind flashed to all the times she'd endured smaller indignities in silence, knowing that no one would back her if she dared to speak up. This time was different, yes, but it was only because the world was watching. She realized then that the airline was trying to protect itself as much as it was trying to support her. "Thank you for the invitation," Jenna replied calmly. "But if I'm going to speak, it's going to be on my terms." After hanging up, Jenna found herself dialing another number, one of the reporters who had reached out, offering her a platform to speak directly to the public. Unfiltered and unscripted, she set up the interview for that evening, feeling the thrill of taking control. As the hour approached, Jenna's heart raced. She had spent the afternoon preparing, replaying every moment of the incident in her mind, drawing from years of buried frustration, memories of countless microaggressions and moments of being belittled. Now, she would finally let it out. And censored. The interview was set up in a quiet, well-lit room, with just Jenna, the reporter, and a single camera. The reporter, a young woman with an empathetic gaze, sat across from her, offering a nod of encouragement. "Jenna, I know this is difficult," she began gently, "but can you take us back to that night? Can you tell us what was going through your mind?" Jenna looked into the camera, feeling the weight of the nation's gaze. She took a deep breath and began, her voice steady but filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. "That night was one of the hardest of my life, but it was also just the tip of the iceberg. What happened on that flight, that wasn't just about me or one woman's anger. This was a moment that exposed something much deeper, something that so many people face every day." Silently, she spoke about the humiliation of being bitten, of feeling like an object of scorn simply for existing. But then, she went further, speaking not just of that one night but of a lifetime of quiet, bruising encounters. She talked about the endless balancing act, trying to be professional while carrying the invisible weight of others' biases. Her voice wavered at moments, but she held her ground, speaking truths she had never dared to voice before. "This isn't just about air travel or one hateful incident," she continued. "It's about a system that lets people believe they can treat others like they're less than human, just because of their race or because they're in a position of service. I know that this isn't just my story. It's the story of so many people, and I am tired of watching it happen." The reporter leaned forward, captivated. "Jenna, what would you like to see change?" Jenna's eyes sharpened, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority. "I want accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt invisible or devalued. Airlines and every other industry need to put protections in place, not just for their passengers, but for the people working on the front lines. We need real policies, real consequences, not just empty words. The interview wrapped up, and Jenna felt a strange lightness settle over her. For once, she had spoken her truth without fear, and she knew it had struck a chord. As the video went live, views skyrocketed within minutes, her words echoing across social media, talk shows, and news sites. By that evening, Jenna's phone was flooded again, this time with calls from civil rights groups, unions, and even a few politicians. People wanted to meet, to support her call for change, and to amplify her message even further. What had started as one voice in the dark was becoming a chorus, a force that could no longer be ignored. As she lay in bed that night, exhausted but exhilarated, Jenna felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Real, tangible hope. Her story had unlocked something in people, a long-buried desire for justice and dignity that now burned like a wildfire across the country. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had sparked something much bigger than herself, and as she closed her eyes, Jenna knew she would never return to silence. She was stepping into a new chapter, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to endure, to hold back. This time, Jenna Williams was ready to push forward, to fight, and to be heard. Jenna sat at her kitchen table, watching her inbox fill with a mixture of supportive messages and requests for interviews. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the interview aired the night before. She glanced out her window, letting the morning light pour in, momentarily calming the torrent of thoughts swirling in her mind. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also came with a pressure she hadn't anticipated, a pressure to push forward, to carry this momentum until real change happened. Just then, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but she recognized the area code from her airline's headquarters. She took a steadying breath before answering. "Hello, Jenna? This is Michael Pierce, the CEO of Transatlantic Airways. I'm reaching out because we've seen the impact of your story, and we want to work with you to make meaningful changes within the airline." Jenna was taken aback. She had expected her story to make waves, but she hadn't anticipated hearing from the top of the company. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Pierce," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm glad to hear the company is ready to make some real changes." "Absolutely," he responded, though his voice carried a hint of caution. "We'd like to invite you to our headquarters to discuss your ideas and to explore how we can implement better policies. This isn't just about repairing our image. We genuinely want to do better by our employees." The invitation was tempting, yet Jenna remained wary. The airline was in damage control mode, and she knew their motivation was as much about public perception as it was about improving conditions for their staff. But if this meeting could lead to real changes, Jenna was willing to take the risk. 2 days later, Jenna arrived at the airline's sleek headquarters, a towering glass building that loomed over the city skyline. She stepped inside, her heels echoing on the polished marble floor, her nerves tingling with a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. As she approached the reception desk, she was greeted by a friendly young woman who led her to a conference room filled with several senior executives, including Pierce. "Jenna, thank you for joining us," Pierce said, offering a handshake as she entered. The room felt formal, almost intimidating, with its expansive windows and perfectly arranged seating. She shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. Pierce gestured to a seat at the head of the table. "We're here because we understand this incident has uncovered some deep-rooted issues, not only within our company but within the entire industry. We want to hear from you, what you believe needs to change." Jenna took a seat, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. They looked eager, if a bit nervous, as if bracing for what she might say. She placed her notepad on the table, the pages filled with notes and ideas she'd been developing for days. "Thank you for giving me this platform," she began, her voice firm but calm. "The reality is that incidents like what happened to me are far more common than people realize. It's just that most of them go unreported or don't receive the same level of attention. Flight attendants face abuse every day, and it's usually swept under the rug. This has to change. Not just for me, but for everyone who puts on this uniform." She outlined her ideas, each point more pressing than the last. Mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, policies to protect flight attendants from abusive passengers and immediate protocols for reporting incidents, clear consequences for passengers who engage in violence or harassment, better support for staff who endure trauma, including counseling services and paid time off. The executives listened intently, nodding along, but she noticed their expressions shift slightly when she brought up stricter consequences for passengers. Pierce, though attentive, leaned forward, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "These are significant changes you're proposing, Jenna," he said. "I don't think anyone here would argue against the need for a safer, more respectful environment, but we also have to consider the impact of some of these measures on our bottom line. We don't want to alienate our customers." Jenna felt a flicker of frustration. She took a deep breath before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Pierce, this isn't just about making passengers feel comfortable. It's about ensuring that your employees are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. When someone like me or any flight attendant is forced to endure abuse in silence, that doesn't just harm us. It erodes the very foundation of trust between this company and its workers. And in the end, it's that foundation that will sustain this airline's reputation." The room fell silent. Jenna could see the executives exchanging glances, some nodding slightly, others furrowing their brows. Pierce leaned back, folding his hands as he considered her words. After a long pause, he spoke. "You're right, Jenna. We can't continue ignoring this issue. We'll commit to implementing the policies you've suggested, and we'll work with our legal and HR teams to ensure these changes are enforceable." Relief and disbelief mingled in Jenna's chest, but she kept her expression steady. "Thank you. I'll be here to help in any way I can." As the meeting concluded, Pierce offered her his hand once more. "You've shown remarkable resilience, Jenna. I hope you know that your bravery is creating a real impact." Jenna nodded, feeling a new strength within her. This isn't just bravery, it's necessity, and it's long overdue. Outside, Jenna took a deep breath as she left the building, the crisp air invigorating her. She had fought hard in that room, holding her ground with a quiet, unyielding strength that made her realize just how far she had come. This battle wasn't just about one woman on one flight, it was about every person who'd ever felt devalued. Every worker who had been forced to endure humiliation for the sake of a paycheck. She checked her phone and saw that her inbox was flooded once again. But this time, there was a message that stood out. An invitation from the National Union of Flight Attendants. They wanted to meet with her to discuss a national initiative aimed at protecting workers from passenger abuse across all airlines. Jenna felt a rush of purpose as she read the message. The momentum was building, and she was ready to ride this wave, no matter where it led. She wasn't just an individual fighting for change. She was now part of a movement, one that had the power to shift an entire industry. That night, as she returned to her hotel room, Jenna stood by the window, looking out over the city lights. She was exhausted but resolute, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. She had planted a seed of change, and now, it was taking root in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. The fight was far from over, but Jenna knew she wasn't alone. She had a community behind her, a groundswell of voices ready to challenge an industry that had overlooked its workers for far too long. And as she drifted to sleep, she felt a new kind of peace, the peace that comes when one finds not only a purpose but the courage to see it through. Jenna awoke to a new world the following morning, a world that seemed to have finally shifted. Her story had gone from a single moment of violence and humiliation to a movement that had struck a nerve across the nation. Her face and name had become symbols of resilience, of a long overdue reckoning, and her inbox overflowed with messages from people she'd never met, but who felt connected to her battle. On her phone, headlines flashed. Jenna Williams' stand for dignity inspires nationwide call for reform. Flight attendants' story sparks airline accountability movement. Beyond the skies, how one woman's story is changing an industry. As she scrolled, Jenna felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. Yet it came with a powerful sense of purpose. People were looking to her to be more than just a voice for change. They wanted her to lead it. And so, without fully knowing what was ahead, she took a steadying breath and dialed the number of the National Flight Attendants Union. Within hours, she was seated in a high-rise conference room, surrounded by union representatives, airline employees, and even a few activists. The union president, a graying man with sharp eyes named Alan Hayes, nodded as she spoke. leaning forward to catch every word. "We need more than just empty policies," Jenna began, her voice carrying through the room. "Airlines across the country need to take real accountability for the way they protect, or don't protect, their employees. There must be systems in place so that workers aren't treated like they're disposable. That their dignity isn't something to be sacrificed for a passenger's comfort." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Jenna could see determination in the eyes of those around her. These were people who had seen the struggles firsthand, who had felt the same frustrations and fears that Jenna had faced on that fateful night. She wasn't alone in this fight. Alan cleared his throat. "Jenna, what you're saying resonates with every flight attendant in this room. But we're up against an industry that's built on image and customer satisfaction. For years, they've buried incidents like this, silencing those who spoke up. If we're going to make this work, we need to unite. This has to be bigger than just one airline or one incident." Jenna nodded, her heart pounding with determination. "Then let's make it big. Let's make sure no one can ignore us." Over the next few hours, they drafted a plan, a nationwide initiative called Protecting Our People. The initiative demanded mandatory training on de-escalation and anti-bias for all employees, a zero-tolerance policy for abusive passengers, and a protocol for ensuring flight attendants were empowered to report incidents without fear of retaliation. They discussed everything from the legal support needed for attendants to a hotline for anonymously reporting abuse. As Jenna watched the plan take shape, she felt a rush of energy. What had started as a painful, personal experience was transforming into something concrete, something powerful. Alan handed her a draft of the proposal. "Jenna, I'd like you to present this at the upcoming industry conference in DC next month. Your story has inspired people across the country. If we want this to reach every airline, we need you to be the one who brings it to the table." Jenna's heart skipped. The idea of standing in front of an audience filled with industry leaders and executives, many of whom would undoubtedly try to dismiss or downplay her words, was daunting. But she knew this was what she had been building toward. This was her moment to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence as she had. She took the document from Alan, meeting his steady gaze. "I'll do it," she said, feeling the weight of her words. "I'll make sure they hear us." In the days that followed, news of the Protecting Our People initiative spread. Media outlets eagerly reported on Jenna's upcoming appearance at the conference, painting her as the face of a new era in airline reform. Her story was no longer just a headline, it was a call to action, a message that echoed through the halls of corporate offices, union meetings, and even congressional chambers. Messages poured in from other flight attendants who felt inspired by her bravery, sharing their own painful experiences of abuse, belittlement, and fear. They told her how her story had given them hope, how it had made them feel seen and valued. And as Jenna read each message, she felt her resolve strengthen. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for an entire workforce, for all the people who had felt small and powerless in the face of entitlement and prejudice. The night before the conference, Jenna lay awake in her hotel room in DC, going over her speech one last time. She knew the room would be filled with people who had the power to make or break her proposal, people who might try to silence her with polite smiles and evasive answers. But she also knew that her voice carried something far more powerful than corporate interests. It carried the strength of a movement. The following morning, as she stood at the podium in the large conference hall, Jenna looked out over the crowd. Rows of executives, union leaders, and journalists filled the seats, their expressions ranging from skepticism to anticipation. She felt a flicker of nerves but quickly quelled it, grounding herself in the knowledge that she was here for a purpose far greater than her own fears. She began to speak, her voice steady and clear, recounting her story and the stories of so many others who had suffered in silence. She described the pain of enduring abuse, the humiliation of being treated as less than human, and the courage it took to stand up and demand respect. She spoke of protecting our people, detailing each point of the initiative with a conviction that resonated through the room. "The time has come for airlines to do more than pay lip service to dignity and respect," she concluded, her voice unwavering. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for basic human decency, for the right to work in an environment free from fear and degradation. This is a chance for this industry to take a stand, to show that it values every person who makes air travel possible, not just those who buy the tickets." Silence hung in the room as Jenna finished, her gaze sweeping across the audience. For a moment, she wasn't sure how they would respond. Then, slowly, one person stood, followed by another, and another, until the entire room was on its feet. Applause filling the hall in waves. Jenna felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had done it. She had made them listen. As she stepped down from the podium, a line of people began forming to shake her hand, to thank her, to offer their support. Among them were CEOs, union leaders, and even government officials, all pledging to bring protecting our people into their own policies. When Jenna returned to her hotel room that night, her phone buzzed with a message from Alan. "You did it, Jenna. They're with us. You've changed the industry today." For the first time, Jenna allowed herself to feel the full weight of her accomplishment. She had taken her pain and turned it into power, using her voice to spark a transformation that would protect countless others. And as she sat by the window, looking out over the city lights, Jenna knew that this was only the beginning. She had started something unstoppable, a movement for dignity, respect, and justice that would ripple far beyond the skies. The conference was over, but the impact of Jenna's speech reverberated far beyond the walls of that room. News outlets and social media platforms buzzed with the story, the words "protecting our people" becoming a rallying cry. For days, Jenna watched as her phone lit up with messages from people she'd inspired, from other flight attendants, labor advocates, and even politicians, all thanking her for her bravery, for daring to stand up in a world that so often pressured people to stay quiet. Yet, as the whirlwind continued around her, Jenna found herself craving solitude, a quiet place where she could reflect on everything that had happened. She had become a symbol, a public face for a movement, but deep down, she still felt like the same woman who had simply wanted to do her job with dignity. One evening, Jenna decided to return home to Harlem, to walk through the familiar streets of her childhood. She had spent years building a life that felt separate from these streets, climbing her way into the world of air travel, of polished uniforms and faraway destinations. But as she strolled down the bustling sidewalks, past the vibrant murals and corner stores, Jenna felt a sense of peace settle over her. Harlem was more than just her home. It was a place that had shaped her resilience, her strength, and her understanding of justice. Every corner held a memory, the stoops where she'd laughed with friends, the bakery where her grandmother used to buy pastries, the community center where she'd spent summers volunteering. She'd grown up surrounded by people who knew struggle and fought against it, who found ways to rise above despite the odds. As she walked, a familiar face called her name. Jenna. It was Mrs. Dawson, an elderly neighbor who had known Jenna since she was a child. Mrs. Dawson's eyes sparkled as she approached, leaning on her cane. "I saw you on the news. You made us all so proud." Jenna smiled, her heart warming at the sight of the woman who had once watched over her and her friends during long summer evenings. "Thank you, Mrs. Dawson. I just did what I felt was right." Mrs. Dawson reached out and held Jenna's hand tightly. "Child, what you did was more than right. You stood up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever felt small. And that takes real courage. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." Jenna nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The words hit her deeply, reminding her of why she had started this journey in the first place. She wasn't just fighting for policy changes or for recognition. She was fighting for the people who rarely had a voice, for the dignity of everyone who worked hard and deserved respect. As she continued her walk, Jenna began to feel a shift within herself. She had spent so much of her life striving for acceptance, for success in a world that didn't always welcome her. But now, she understood that her journey had never really been about fitting in. It was about honoring herself and her community, about creating a space where people like her could thrive without fear. A few days later, Jenna was invited to a small community event at her old high school, where local activists and leaders gathered to discuss issues affecting Harlem. She found herself sitting on a panel, answering questions from young students, many of whom looked at her with admiration and hope in their eyes. One student raised her hand, a teenage girl with braids and an intensity in her gaze. "Ms. Williams," she began, her voice filled with determination. "How do you keep going when the world seems so against you, when people doubt you, or try to silence you?" Jenna paused, feeling the weight of the question. She looked at the girl, seeing a reflection of her younger self, and chose her words carefully. "It's not easy," she admitted. There will always be people who try to diminish you, to make you question your worth. But I've learned that strength isn't just about being loud or fighting back. It's about knowing your own value, even when others don't see it. It's about staying true to yourself, even when the world tries to shape you into something else. The girl nodded, her eyes bright with understanding, and Jenna felt a surge of pride. She had been that girl once, searching for answers, for someone who understood the struggle of standing tall in a world that wanted her to shrink. And now, here she was, offering guidance to the next generation. After the event, Jenna lingered in the school's hallway, looking at the old photographs on the walls. Memories came flooding back, moments of joy and challenges, of triumphs and defeats. She realized that every step of her journey had prepared her for this moment, that each struggle had built her into the woman she was today. A woman who could face an entire industry and demand respect. A woman who was unafraid to use her voice. As she left the school and walked back into the lively streets of Harlem, Jenna felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had found her place, not just in the movement she had sparked, but within herself. She knew that whatever lay ahead, she had the strength to face it. She had her community, her family, and her own hard-won resilience. That night, as Jenna returned to her apartment and looked out over the city lights, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she also knew she was ready. Her journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had learned to trust her voice, her purpose, and her power. Jenna Williams had come home to herself, and as she prepared to take the next step, she knew that, no matter what, she would never again walk in silence.
Quarto. Bạn đã nói. Bằng tiếng Anh viết chương 9 hấp dẫn cuốn hút người đọc. Jack đã nói.
ChatGPT. Chapter 9. A New Era of Accountability. The months following Jenna's speech at the industry conference marked a profound change in the airline world, and beyond. The Protecting Our People initiative had gained traction in ways Jenna could only have dreamed. What started as a painful personal experience had ignited a fire that spread through industries, boardrooms, and social spaces across the country. Airlines were no longer just promising change. They were being held accountable to follow through. And Jenna had become the face of this transformative wave. Jenna's days were filled with meetings, interviews, and conferences, her calendar packed with travel to cities where she spoke at universities, corporate events, and even town halls. She was invited to join discussions with policymakers on labor protections, working alongside unions and activists to craft guidelines for workplace dignity and safety. Her voice was not just a spark, it had become a beacon for those who sought a better future. One morning, as she prepared to fly to Washington, D.C. for a roundtable with lawmakers, Jenna received a message from her airline's CEO, Michael Pierce. He requested a private meeting with her to discuss the latest policy implementations and invited her to tour the airline's training center, where the new anti-bias programs were being launched. Surprised but intrigued, Jenna agreed, eager to see the changes firsthand. Arriving at the center, she was greeted by Pierce himself. They walked through the facility as he showed her the new employee training modules, ones that focused on empathy, respect, and anti-bias practices, led by expert facilitators who spoke with conviction and compassion. "We're seeing a significant shift already," Pierce said, his tone one of pride but also humility. "These sessions are teaching our staff not only to recognize bias but to address it, to understand how deeply it can impact someone's life. It's not perfect, but we're moving in the right direction." Jenna nodded, watching a group of trainees engrossed in a discussion about respect and accountability. She knew it was only a beginning, but it was a beginning that hadn't existed before. Her presence here was a testament to what could happen when people chose to fight for change instead of staying silent. As they walked down the hallway, Pierce stopped and turned to her. "Jenna," he began, a hint of regret in his voice. "I want to thank you, not just for sparking this initiative, but for holding us to a higher standard. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know we failed you that night, but what you've done since has shown us what accountability truly means." Jenna felt a wave of emotion. She had never expected this acknowledgement, not from someone as high up as Pierce. She looked him in the eye, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you, but know this, what happened that night isn't just a failure to me. It was a failure to everyone who works here, who deserves respect and dignity every day. This change is about more than policies. It's about changing an entire culture. Pierce nodded, visibly moved by her words. He extended his hand, and Jenna shook it, feeling a sense of closure but also a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that this work would continue, that her mission would not end with this company alone. But in this moment, she had planted the seed of something that could grow far beyond even her own vision. As Jenna walked out of the training center, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article headline, "The movement continues. How one woman's stand is transforming labor protections across industries." She scrolled through, reading about new initiatives inspired by protecting our people. Companies in other sectors were implementing similar policies, addressing biases and protections in fields as diverse as healthcare, education, and customer service. Jenna's heart swelled with pride as she realized just how far the impact of her fight had spread. Her story had touched lives she would never meet, inspiring people to believe in a better way forward. The words "protecting our people" were no longer just about flight attendants. They had become a universal message of dignity and respect. That evening, she returned to her hotel, exhausted but fulfilled. As she looked out over the city lights, Jenna felt a deep sense of satisfaction and resolve. She had fought her way through doubt, pain, and fear to stand for what was right, and now, the world was following her lead. In the quiet of her room, she composed a social media post. Her words simple yet powerful. "Today, I saw change with my own eyes. What began as my story is now part of a collective movement. Proof that when we demand respect and accountability, the world has no choice but to listen. Let's keep going. Let's keep protecting our people." Everywhere, the post went viral within minutes, people across the country sharing it with messages of solidarity and hope. And as Jenna closed her phone, she realized she was no longer just an advocate, no longer just a voice. She was now a leader in a movement that would continue to grow, reaching new heights, touching new industries, and reshaping how the world valued its workers. Jenna knew her journey was far from over, but she was ready. She had seen firsthand what one voice could do, and she believed, now more than ever, that nothing was impossible. As she drifted to sleep, a final thought filled her mind, one that she knew would carry her forward into whatever the future held. Change is unstoppable when courage becomes contagious. Months had passed since the night Jenna Williams stood on that flight, enduring the hatred of one passenger but sparking the courage of thousands. What had started as a painful ordeal had become a movement that swept across industries, inspiring conversations and actions that were once unimaginable. Protecting our people had become a model for labor protections, and Jenna's face had become a symbol of resilience and unyielding strength. She had become the catalyst for a shift, a legacy that reached far beyond the cabin of an airplane. One sunny afternoon, Jenna was back in New York, speaking at a university event for young activists. The room buzzed with excitement, students filling every seat, leaning forward eagerly to hear her story. Jenna looked out at them, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose she had only begun to understand. These young people were the future, the ones who would carry the torch, who would take her story and build on it in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she began to speak, she saw their faces light up, nodding along as she described the highs and lows of her journey, the strength it had taken to confront an industry, and the courage she had found within herself to become a voice for change. She shared the painful moments, the uncertainty, the fear, the anger, but she also shared the victories, the way one small act of defiance had rippled out into a powerful wave of reform. "I want you to remember something," she said, her voice resonant in the quiet room. "You don't have to be famous or powerful to make a difference. Change begins with a single voice, one person willing to say, 'This isn't right.' Sometimes that voice is yours, and sometimes it's the person beside you. But when you stand together, your voices become unstoppable." After her speech, a line of students formed to thank her, some sharing their own stories of injustice, others simply offering words of gratitude. One young woman, clutching a notepad with shaking hands, looked up at Jenna with tear-filled eyes. "Because of you, Ms. Williams, I believe I can make a difference. I don't have to be afraid to speak up anymore." Jenna took the young woman's hands, her heart swelling with pride. "You have more power than you realize. Don't ever forget that." Later that evening, Jenna returned home to Harlem, her mind racing with the stories she'd heard, the passion she'd seen in the students' faces. She walked through her apartment, a space that had once been her refuge but was now a constant reminder of the journey she had undertaken. On the table lay stacks of letters from people across the country, each one thanking her, sharing stories of resilience and courage inspired by her stand. One letter caught her eye. It was from a young flight attendant in a small town in Texas. The woman wrote about an incident she had recently faced, where a passenger had insulted her based on her race. Instead of shrinking back, the young woman had reported the incident, her complaint backed by the new policies that protecting our people had established. The passenger had been held accountable, and the woman had received an apology from her airline. Jenna's eyes misted as she read the letter, realizing the true impact of her efforts. She hadn't just changed policies. She had changed lives, given people the courage to demand respect, to know that they were worth more than silent endurance. Just then, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. The Protecting Our People Act gains bipartisan support in Congress. Jenna read the headline twice, hardly believing it. Months of tireless advocacy, countless meetings, and a groundswell of public support had finally led to this, a federal act that would protect workers in all industries from abuse, harassment, and discrimination. Her movement had crossed into the halls of power, and the nation was on the brink of enshrining her fight into law. As the reality sank in, Jenna felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had taken the first step, but it had been the voices of countless others that had carried this movement forward. She was no longer alone. Her story had woven itself into a larger tapestry of change, a collective journey toward dignity and justice. The next morning, Jenna was invited to witness the announcement in Washington, D.C. She stood on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by fellow advocates, politicians, and leaders from across the country who had come together to celebrate this milestone. When her name was called to speak, Jenna stepped forward, looking out at the crowd with a quiet, powerful pride. "This isn't just my victory," she began, her voice steady. "This is a victory for everyone who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or told they didn't matter. Today, we're sending a message to every worker in every industry. You deserve respect. You deserve to feel safe. And you deserve to know that your voice has power." As she finished, applause erupted around her, the sound washing over her like a wave. She looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. She had started this journey to reclaim her dignity, to demand justice in a world that often felt indifferent. But along the way, she had found something even greater, an unbreakable connection to people everywhere who were fighting for the same dream. That night, as Jenna sat alone in her hotel room, she felt a peace she hadn't known before. She knew that the work would continue, that there would always be new challenges, new battles to fight, but she also knew that she had laid a foundation, one that others would build upon long after she was gone. Jenna Williams had become more than a voice for change. She was a legacy, a testament to the power of resilience and the belief that even one person's courage could transform the world. And as she looked out over the city lights, Jenna allowed herself a smile, knowing that the journey she had begun was far from over, but that it would always burn bright, lighting the way forward for generations to come.